all this is kind of like the start of a radio show in the morning. Um, I'm honored to be here, and especially honored that Brad asked me to be here and do this. This is kind of like Uncle Jerry bringing home his vacation slides to show you. I hope I don't bore you. I hope you find it interesting. Before I start with it, though, I'd like to take a quick moment. This past Tuesday was Veterans Day, and ask any veterans that are in the audience. I know I see a Korean vet there, to stand up so we could acknowledge you and say thank you. Thank you. And sir, were you in World War II? Yeah, right behind you, yeah. Well, thank you very much. And throughout this presentation, again, we'll kind of stumble. This is not going to be real smooth. I'll stumble around. This is not my computer and whatnot. And I'll tell you about how the broadcast came about and what I did when I was over there. And I'm happy to take any questions throughout or at the very end. If you want to ask any questions, I'd be happy to answer them or try to answer them. One of the things that and also, just a caveat, if I sound like I'm boasting or bragging about the radio station, I am. And with some shock at the fact that of all these corporate giants in radio, I'm kind of I am a dinosaur in radio these days. I'm an owner, operator, mom and pop, and I'm the mom and the pop. And this 70th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy, the only radio station in the entire United States of America that went over there and did what we did was your local radio station, mine, KKFT. And it was just one of those opportunities that we jumped on, and I'll tell you how it came about. My daughter was working for a fairly young guy who's been very, very successful, and he has a place right in the town of Olgot, which is just, I'd say about 10 miles east of Sword Beach, and has a historic home right on the beach. And in fact, when the Germans were in France and invaded, they went through all those old historic homes right on the beach, and they took out the staircases and the ceilings just to basically make them uninhabitable or usable, because they were sitting right on the beach. Perhaps they could have been used as a defense perimeter or something, but so that's where we did the broadcast from. When we were first invited to go over, we checked airfares and said, because of my business, about the most I feel comfortable leaving the business for is about a week at a time, and we checked airfares and said it's not really worth, I think it was $2,500 per ticket to go over there for just a week. And I never thought of doing anything other than, visiting maybe Montana or Wyoming as opposed to going to France. Anyway, I started doing a little homework, and we were invited there. They wanted us there the first week of June. And I said, well, wait a minute, that's June 6th. And then my wife's uncle was with the 101st Screaming Eagles and was dropped in behind enemy lines on D-Day. And so we said, well, that's kind of a sign. We need to go. And then we thought, well, let's not just go. Let's try to bring something back home and do a broadcast here locally. And the guy who invited us over is in the technical business, internet type business, and has developed a lot of softwares and actually equipment for the computer industry. It has over the years. And so he set up a network for us, and we went over there. And what we did is we got there a couple of days early, and the first interview, which we have some of and some pictures of, it took place on Wednesday at a historic estate. It's 500 acres. It's called the WWII. And I did a Google Earth search of it, and it actually comes up in Google Earth, and you can zoom in, see it. It was an abbey that was built in 1150 and added on to. And that's where we did the interview for the day. And what was significant, and my host invited me to go interview her, is she was 8 or 9 years old when the Germans invaded, and they actually occupied her home. It's on high ground, and it was mostly the Hitler Youth that was at the estate, and they stayed in the garage and upstairs. They weren't allowed to come into the home. In fact, when the Germans invaded, her grandfather or great-grandfather went down to the local town where the German offices were and said, this is a historic home built in 1150 as an abbey. You can't destroy it, you can't. And they actually came home with a piece of paper, was posted, and the Germans weren't allowed to go into this one particular wing of this estate. And again, in the interview, and as we wrapped up the interview, we went walking around some interesting things about it, which are, by the way, on the DVD, and I'll tell you about that a little bit later, is that because of fuel supplies, or lack thereof, and all that sort of thing, they actually had a little vehicle called a Cinca that was parked in the dining room. It was about that big. It was, if you took a partition across this wall, that's how big the dining room was. And there are also some, unfortunately, they weren't preserved over the years, but the German soldiers, out of being homesick and whatnot, they would draw on the walls of this garage. And they're actually pretty good. There were drawings of an Indian chief with headdress, an American Indian. And there was also the monkey see, monkey do thing, and then some Alps, some mountains and lakes and that sort of thing. And whatever they were drawn on the walls with is really starting to fade. Unfortunately, I forgot to take pictures of that, but we walked around the estate. She also talked about how her and her sister, as kind of a game, they would go out and they would steal bullets from the German soldiers and then take them and throw them in. She called it a lake. It was a little pond, not much bigger than this room, but they would throw the bullets into the pond as kind of a game. And I said, well, you were part of the French Resistance. And anyway, very, very nice lady. And it was, for me, to go to a place that was built in 1150. The patriarch of that family was actually one of the, somewhat like a Thomas Jefferson of France. He introduced education to all the rural areas of France, Normandy in particular, and got to go up into his room and see his books, his library, and all the furniture and everything. And it was just a great experience for me. That was on Wednesday. And Thursday, we went over to Omaha Beach. And what was really neat about that were the veterans that were there, and they were literally treated like rock stars. I mean, beautiful women, all the people, some of them in wheelchairs, would want to get up, get photos of them. And this one guy in particular I remember somebody would get a picture with him, and he'd hand him a picture of himself at 19 in his uniform. And so that made me feel really good, along with the fact that there were just buses and buses, probably thousands of school children. You might even say they do that in France as opposed to the United States, but the French children, it's a holiday over there, it's Liberty. And so they bus the children in from all over France to Omaha Beach, the memorial and everything on D-Day. And that was, to me, very gratifying to see that. I don't know if they do it every year. It's the 70th anniversary. It's not going to be the last commemoration, but in particular, it was the last for the Normandy Veterans Association. That's mostly the British soldiers because of the age. So this was their last commemoration, and I did several interviews with those guys, and they were having a great time and drinking champagne, and it was that too a great experience. Obviously, it was the time difference what it was, but we were pretty much doing the broadcast. We started the broadcast 25 minutes before the first boat hit the beach. So to me, I was kind of envisioning that if you were sitting here and putting yourself in that time frame in France on that morning. And the weather that day on June 6th was absolutely stunning, beautiful. The day before, and one of the points that Pauline, the woman of Al Rocher, pointed out was that when we were walking around the grounds and everything, is that day was, she said, so much like D-Day. She remembered D-Day being cold and windy, which it was on the 5th. On the 6th was actually a beautiful day. This is how we started our broadcast that morning at 6:05.
Sailors and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. the eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
And now, commemorating the 70th anniversary of D-Day, June 6th, 1944. Live from Normandy, France, Northern Nevada's own 99.1 FM Talk. Here's Jerry Evans.
And a good morning to you. Let me do a test 1, 2, 3 and do a quick adjustment here on this end. And we are coming to you live from the town of Olgot, which is on the beach at Normandy. I'm standing at the bottom floor of a historic home looking out at a beautiful day.
That was, of course, Eisenhower's radio speech, and radio was so much more important back then than it, unfortunately, than it is now to most youth. But I still rely on it feeding me. But anyway, that's how we started our broadcast, and there were just a few glitches, but again, today's technology, what it was to me, it was, I think, ambitious, but also the fact that we pulled off 3 hours of live broadcast from the beach there. That home that you saw right at the very end was the home that in the bottom floor, I was looking out at the beach. From there is where we did the broadcast. And when you do these sort of things too, once we decided that we would definitely go over there and attempt to do this, you have to think about the costs and expenses of doing everything. And so you approach local businesses to see if they want to sponsor, give them the exposure that they deserve for doing that. And Anderson Dorn Rader was one of the first ones to step up and say, yes, we want to be a part of the broadcast. And then a friend of Brad's, a family friend by the name of Clarence Vickery, he put me in touch with. And as soon as I find the cut here, I'll pull it up. And again, for me, it was just the fact that I could talk to somebody that landed on the beach that day. In fact, another guy coming up here in a moment, Buster Sheaf, landed at 6:37. The first boat hit the beach at 6:32. So Clarence put me in touch with Clarence Vickery, who's 92 years old, been married for 68 years. He and his wife were at a home in Idaho, and talked to him for a good 10 or 15 minutes or so. And this is just part of the conversation with Clarence.
How often do you think about it?
Well, I tried to forget it after the war was over.
Yeah.
And I never talked about it to anybody until the last 4 or 5 years when they become interested in World War II again. I never even told my parents all the situations I went through because I was trying to forget it. And they didn't ask me, and I didn't tell them.
Certainly understandable. I'm glad you're talking with us this morning. It's Clarence Vickery. who lives in Idaho now, grew up in a small town in Wyoming, and was there on D-Day, on the invasion in Normandy on June 6th, 1944. And here we are talking about it 70 years later. Tell me about the rest of your service in the military after D-Day. Did you go through Normandy and Holland?
After we landed, we were on an LST. It had the two big wing doors on the front of it that opened up, ramps that laid down so that equipment could be unloaded. And we went as close to the shore as we could, and they set the ramp down, and we drove off the ramp onto the beach when it was without getting into too much water. And then we went up on the first bench and kind of assembled. We never stopped working from the time we landed for 3 days. We worked continually, and we were completely wore out. And our lieutenant said to us, "You deserve a rest. Go to that staging area where they're unloading their bags and stuff, and take a rest." We went there at 4 o'clock in the morning, laid down on the ground and went to sleep. And at 6 o'clock, the Germans bombed us with anti-personnel bombs, and we lost 13 men in that bombing. And then we got up and went back to work, because it was safer to work than it was to stop.
Clarence, were you in Europe on VE Day and in May?
Yes.
What do you remember about that day? Where were you?
I was stationed in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. The day that the war was declared over, our unit went into Pilsen, Czechoslovakia.
And one of the things that, as you heard there, this was 3 days after the invasion, and they were still got bombed on the beach and lost some men. And then, after this 12-hour invasion of the beach there and everything, what they continued to go through for 11 months until VE Day in May was announced. And so Clarence, again, he's 92 years old. He is in Idaho, and you think about what these 18, 19-year-olds went through, not only on D-Day and what they saw on that day, but also to what they did for the next, not just 11 months. I mean, some of them were sent to the Pacific Theater and fought there as well. Just to survive that and be sitting here with us today, in particular, is... and there was one thing that Clarence said, right, and Clarence is just a super nice guy. You could tell over the phone, and the state of Idaho is doing a DVD for Idaho D-Day vets that he talked about during the interview, and so he's getting some recognition in some cases that's long overdue, and so he was pretty proud of that. But he said one thing right at the end of the interview that struck me.
We really appreciate what you did, and for you to be able to spend some time with us this morning on the radio. And what are some of the best memories that you have from going through what you went through in the military? Was it the brotherhood, the people you served with?
The people I served with are like brothers to me today. I'm still in contact with them through the newsletter that they put out every 3 months. It's they ask each veteran to write a letter, and it's put in all the letters are printed and mailed back to us, so we have contact with each other.
Clarence, it's an honor to speak to you, and I appreciate your wife allowing us. What's your wife's name again?
Mary.
I appreciate Mary letting you speak to us today, and just want to, again, thank you, and we admire you and what you did, and we really, really appreciate you taking the time to visit with us this morning.
Yeah, I hope they don't forget us from now on.
We will not let that happen. Believe me, we won't let it happen. Thank you, Clarence, so much.
So that was Clarence, and I thought even saying, I hope they don't forget us this time. And which, again, for these guys like Clarence and this other gentleman.
Buster Schaaf is my guest on KKF.
That I'll start from there in just a moment. Buster Schaaf, they're 92 years old, or in their 90s. And to remember the details of this and their life, I can't remember what I read last month, let alone, but to have this memory is really amazing to me. Like Clarence, this next person I talked to is a guy by the name of Buster Schaaf. And Buster, he arrived on the beach at 6:37. And they made 3 trips running soldiers in and out that day. And as most of you know that know some of the history, there were just getting to the beach was an accomplishment with the weather what it was. Some of them, there's a quote in a book, and one of the books I read before this called The Bedford Boys, which Buster refers to a family. And if any of you know the story about Bedford and the fact that they lost 27 boys that day, or within 2 days. I think 19 that day, and within 2 days there were 27 from one little town of about 4,000 people in Virginia. The Boys of Bedford is the name of the book, and Buster refers to one of the guys there, and Buster actually worked at the museum, and I get the two mixed up. The World War II museum is in New Orleans. The other museum is in Bedford, Virginia. I forget the name of that one, but he actually volunteered there. And so 92 years old, and also married to his wife for 68 years. This is Buster Schaaf.
Buster Schaaf is my guest on KKFT, a D-Day veteran who was on the LCVPs that took troops into Omaha Beach on D-Day and was there 5 minutes after H hour. I believe it started 6:30 or 6:32 in the morning is when the first craft arrived. Buster, there was one of those boats also sunk. Did you happen to see that?
Well, I didn't see it. We, of course, heard that some of them did. The water was awfully rough, and with a full load on, we were sitting very low in the water and taking on quite a bit of water. And the one that you were reading about was the one that Roy Stevens was on.
And I believe it was Roy that had a twin brother that got killed.
Right.
Yeah, and found his, as macabre as it sounds, found his brother in a body bag as they were starting to bury them there on the beach
Right.
in Normandy. And one of the many thousands of sad stories that come from that day. And I don't want you to talk about anything, Buster, that you feel uncomfortable talking about. But you were landing there 5 minutes after everything started. There had to be just massive casualties on the beach.
Well, yeah, after or during our second and third trips in, we saw right much wreckage on the beach and bodies laying around that they hadn't gotten up yet. And it was, of course, we knew what we had to do, and we basically did it. And we could see these bodies and injured people laying around, and it was bothersome, but we still had to do it.
Again, when you talk to these guys and you realize what they did and what they went through, and I pictured, because I have 2 sons that are vets, and but I picture parents back then sending their sons off, or their sons signing up and heading out to war, and maybe 1 or 2 visits before D-Day, in some cases none, but then losing your son, finding out, it took about a month to find out, losing your son, perhaps on Omaha Beach, finding out a month later. And the Stevens brothers, the twin brothers from Bedford, they're still at the cemetery there above Omaha Beach. And you know, the economy back then, I mean, people just didn't, especially if you were from a farming community in Virginia, you didn't hop on the plane and go to a service for your son in France. So last memory might be a letter or seeing them from 2 years prior and them being buried there. And they left them there because I forget the exact comment in the book, but to keep them together where they died. One of the other really poignant things when you walk around the cemetery there that struck me, I didn't quite get it at first, but as you're walking through and you see all these crosses, and then you see some of them that look like the lettering is in gold, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a Medal of Honor recipient, if they have the gold lettering. But other people, they'll take sand from the beach where they died, and they'll put it in the cross in the engraved lettering, and it stays there. I don't know how long. Maybe they spray it with something to keep it there. But another kind of a poignant moment for me is to go. Anyway, Buster, a nice, super nice guy from Virginia, and this guy up here, let's see, that'd be your upper left, is a guy named Henry Grew, and he was having a great time. He was a little sauced, and I think that was part of his Navy military career, was getting sauced too, because you'll hear he forgot to go home one day. But anyway, this is the veteran down here on the lower left. There was a chaperone with him, and the chaperone was telling me that the story about you can't even get a permit to leave the country when you're that age because they don't want to pay for you to come home. But there's one particular British guy who recognizes what America did.
I want to share with you some conversations we had with the Normandy Veterans Association members. These were British people, and also the first one you'll notice in particular, his wife. In my conversation with him, he always wanted to return to his wife that he lost about 5 years ago. So, Craig, if you've got that queued up, would you play Henry Grew? And he was part of the British Navy. Where were you on VE Day when victory was declared? Where were you?
Well, I'm afraid I got a bit tipsy. I come home, left barracks, got up into London by Piccadilly and Leicester Square, and forgot to go home. When I did get home, I got a real chousing. You never forget that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really lovely. My wife was a lovely woman. Yeah. Beautiful.
He kept returning to the conversation of he was missing his wife. His children were there with him, but he was a character, and as I said, the champagne was flowing and the British were having a good time. Reg Stevens, Light Attack Regiment, the Royal Artillery, and participated in shooting down a plane. And Craig, Reg Stevens, please.
What did you do on D-Day?
On D-Day, I spent the morning bailing out the boat we drowned.
Were you coming in on a Higgins boat?
Yeah, we were coming in. We should have been the first in with the Marine Commandos. Mm-hmm. But in fact, the boat drowned, and somehow they asked for volunteers, but all the gunners were so sick. I was the only one that could stand, so I did that with a Marine Commando. Mm-hmm. And we bailed and bailed and bailed till we were completely exhausted. I nearly got washed overboard, my hat disappeared, and well, somehow something crashed into it during the night, awful bang, mm-hmm. and the shout went out, jump for it. And the gunner that was leaning up against the tank with me said, let the effing thing go down. I'm going down with it. I can't take any more. They were so violently seasick.
And one of the things also that in a book called The Boys of Bedford, when they pull up on shore, and of course, as miserable as they were because the sea was so rough, and they saw some of the dead soldiers on the beach, who I remember a comment in particular was, at least they are not sick anymore, something to that effect. And one quick last little audio bite, after I talked to Reg Stevens, a very distinguished Englishman, was that his wife Shirley came up to me immediately after, and it kind of explains the importance of the 70th anniversary, but one other thing about soldiers talking about what happened to them. Shirley Stevens, please. Shirley Stevens, you were saying that Reg did not open up?
No, I've been married to Reg for many years, as you can appreciate. I knew very little about what happened to him during the war. Sometimes he would talk about the funny things, but nothing about the serious things and the horror that they went through. And it was only when we returned to Normandy for the 65th commemoration, we travelled with a group of air training cadets, and quite naturally they wanted to talk to the veterans, and he opened up to them, and I learnt more on that coach journey in all our married life.
5 years ago.
Yes. Oops, here we go again.
A pause for the airplane to go over. It's important for you to be here today, obviously.
It's very important that the veterans are here today, because it will be the last commemoration, major commemoration. You've got to understand that these men are 90 years old plus.
Yes.
And for them, the travelling becomes more difficult. And also, in many ways, it becomes more poignant for them, because they return to Normandy, to their mates' graves, to remember them, and yet they do remember them, but it becomes more poignant because they've had a life. Reg's one particular friend died, he was 20. So it becomes more difficult in lots of ways when they stand in some of the cemeteries. But they are determined to come back. Whether we will have the opportunity to return again obviously depends on how well Reg keeps, and whether we can, get back here.
I love the British, the way they refer to it. It depends on how well he keeps, like pickles in the cellar. But there are some other interviews with some of the British guys, and I set it up that it wasn't there, but there was one of the British guys in particular said, "We thank America, and we know we wouldn't be free today if it weren't for Americans." And again, that took place at Sword Beach. The planes flying over the restored bomber planes and everything is really have many of you been there to Normandy? Raise your hand if you have. Great. You've probably got some questions or some comments that you can add to my short 3 or 4 days there. That again, it's one of those things where you could never thought of going to France. Spent 3 days in Paris too, which turned out to be as you might expect. Smoke alarm going off because somebody was smoking in the room, and 7 hours later we were still waiting to get into our room. Anyway, different story. Not on the DVD. I was walking down the day, one of the great stories too, there's a woman from Gardnerville. I live in Gardnerville. Her name's Carol Wenzel. And when we were announcing that we were going to Normandy to commemorate this and everything, she asked me to go look at her uncle's grave. And she gave me the plot number, the row number, and everything. And her name's Carol Wenzel. And so I mentioned that on the air that we had gone and we had found the grave. And there were American and French flags in front of every cross there, or French and British flags at the other cemeteries. But at the American cemetery there, at the memorial, there were French and American flags there. And then, so we went and got also a yellow rose that was there and put it in front of the cross, and took a picture of it and sent it to her. She was choked up like I get at times, but it was such a for someone to say, "Would you please go see and honor my uncle and his gravesite," was, to me, honored me. We walked down.
Carol.
Wait a second. we walk down from the cemetery, as those of you that have been there, it's above Omaha Beach. There's now a walkway down to the beach, a cement walkway. And as you see in the background, I can see it better here. I don't know if you can. It's all green and lush from the sand up to the cemetery now, which wasn't like it was on the invasion. It was more just sand dunes and grass. And so this gentleman that I'm going to talk to here, the woman to my left there is the woman with the World War II museum in New Orleans, and she was chaperoning him around. And the guy standing behind me is with, I will say this, he was a Holland reporter, and he recorded our interview while I was recording him. And this guy was looking for where he stormed Omaha Beach, and he was trying to figure out to where exactly did I come up, and was probably 200 or 300 yards from where he ran up the beach that day. His name's Cosmo Utero.
Cosmo Utero, I'm originally from Massachusetts.
Okay, and what company were you with?
H Company.
You were here on D-Day.
Yes, Omaha. The orders landed. I was carrying ammunition for mortars, and I lost everything getting off the landing craft because there was a crater there. And so when I landed, I had nothing. I had to pick up a rifle from someone, so.
Where we're sitting right now is 200 or 300 yards off the beach. Can you kind of remember where you came in?
I tried it down here. I didn't, because I remember there was a bunker house to the right. I don't see any structures here now. I see a small piece of foundation there. That may have been it. I'm not sure. But I was about 200 or 300 yards to the left of that when I landed, and worked my way, because I couldn't go over the cliff, so I worked my way to the right, because there was an opening where I think this foundation is the only opening, so I had to get up through that way. The rangers claimed went up the cliffs, but I couldn't do that. So, and I didn't know. I said all I had was a rifle. I had nothing else. And, worried about the Germans maybe using gas. That's I worried not having a gas mask if that happened. So I finally met up with some of my company when I got up around the opening there, and it wasn't until the next morning that I got the company got together with the rest of my platoon.
Again, just to me, amazing. You're within a couple of hundred yards where 70 years ago the guy was running up the beach getting shot at. You saw a picture of the German bunkers there too. You can walk through those, what's left of them, up on the upper part of the beach, and to me it was amazing to be there. And then I have one more, maybe two quick sound bites, and then love to talk to you and see if there's. This is the woman named Pauline, who's in her early 80s now, and was on Val Rocher when the Germans invaded and they took over her home. She actually says throughout the interview that they were very nice to her the entire time. Again, it was the Hitler Youth. Most of them were, anywhere from 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, and they just wanted to be left alone. She talked about one day, it was Hitler's birthday, and they were having a big party in the Palouse, as she called it. The Abbey is built like a big L, or the home, I should say, now is built like a big L, and there's a big grassy area, and they were having a big party because it was Hitler's birthday, and some planes started flying over, and she essentially said they scattered and disappeared in 10 seconds. She didn't know where they went. Some of the other interesting things was that when I think she refers to it in the little soundbite about her and her sister would lay on the grass and watch the planes go over on D-Day and try to count them, and then when they came back, there weren't as many. And also they dropped, she called them pom-poms. Her English is not the best, but better than my French. And they dropped these gold foil pom-poms, as she called them. You might picture something like pom-poms to confuse the radar and whatnot. And she watched that and everything. Also lost a lot of family members, not immediate family, but cousins. She had a cousin that was part of the French resistance. One of the cousins she calls it a kayak across the English Channel. It's some form of a boat to, I think that's on here. Let me play it and see.
No, we had, in the family, we had two cousins who decided to go to London. So they took what we called a kayak.
A kayak across the channel.
Voila. And so they did the war, and one was killed in Alsace, and the other one was just hurted. And another cousin, the same family, was doing some resistance in Paris. You know, he was very young, he was 17, and he went in a camp in Germany.
They sent him to a concentration camp.
Yeah, and he died over there. So it's a lot for the same family. And you know, sometimes we were landing on les pelouses, on the grass, and looking the planes going to Germany, you know, les soucoupes volantes, we call this.
Flying saucers.
And we counted them. And there were a lot of them.
Do you remember how many you counted in one day?
No, but you had 60 or something like that, or 50, and we counted them when they came back from Germany, and some were missing.
She referred to the planes as flying saucers, said a French word, and my host was there to interpret for what she was saying. I just found that amazing that it was, and when I first heard and my host had said, you should interview her, should make your broadcast because she was 8 or 9 when the Germans occupied her home. I pictured it as more like it was especially when I did a Google search of it and saw that it was high ground view all the way around 500 acres. I pictured it as being some sort of German command post. It wasn't, but very historical, and to walk into and sit in a place that was built in the year 1150, to me was pretty amazing. It's in pretty good shape too. A lot of historic artifacts in the room too. Gazot was not the patriarch, but it was the great-great-grandfather that bought the home when it was an abbey and turned it to a home. If you want to look it up, I think it's spelled Gauzit, and that was her great-great-grandfather or something to that effect. I have one last little quick thing, again, and this is probably more for a shameless plug for the radio station. Politics completely aside, Governor Sandoval doesn't talk to talk radio at all. However, that being said, since he's been in office and since he's been in office, he's actually gone on the air with us twice. Once during a 9/11 anniversary, it was a 10-year anniversary, and then we invited him to be a part of the broadcast here. And just a quick clip.
No, it's a true honor to be included today, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thoughts, family members, or just the historic significance of this day in American history?
It brings many thoughts. First and foremost, my grandfather fought in the Pacific Theater during World War II and was a decorated veteran, and so it really brings back fond memories for me of him. Obviously, this is a huge day in American history. It was the largest seaborne invasion in the history of mankind, and 160,000 soldiers who marched onto the beach and gave their lives for us and for freedom throughout the world. And then finally, one of the big Nevada connections is the USS Nevada was one of the battleships that was out there and participated in the invasion as well.
Governor, I wanted to share this with you. I mentioned it several times this morning in visiting the cemetery in Omaha Beach yesterday. And today in France, it is a somewhat of a holiday. And that I was so heartened to see all of the kids that were bussed in from schools, French kids, and all of the people, all of the English people that were at the American cemetery yesterday and participating in the events and honoring and thanking Americans for their sacrifice on that day. I thought you'd be happy to hear that as well.
No, I truly am. And after 70 years, I think still people throughout the world know, understand, and appreciate the sacrifice that was made by the United States and our soldiers in terms of liberating France and Europe during World War II. And I've just taken time and asked all Nevadans and all Americans to take the time to pause and stop and pray and give thanks for what they did for us.
So that was Governor Sandoval, and with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions, and if you've been there or anything you want to add, let's hear it. Probably the best thing to do is raise your hand. With that, you're dismissed. No. Yvonne, they would like to mic you, which it doesn't hurt. I get mic'd all the time.
My name is Yvonne French. My husband, Mel, and I made our pilgrimage to the beaches in 2008. June 6. We wanted to be at Omaha on June 6. And I have to say that it was the most moving experience in my life. Not only to see what Mr. Evans had presented, a lot of the vets, a lot of the beautiful, countryside, but the moving experience of the American cemetery. And just rows and rows of these beautiful white crosses out of a particular granite, as I understand. But anyway, one of the things that just so took me back was in the little town of St. Mary de Glace. The French had actually set up a bivouac, and people rent jeeps and uniforms of the 40s, the American uniforms, and they get all dressed up. And it was really something to walk through this little town and see this event taking place. But while we were at the American cemetery, I was getting ready to walk out toward the bus, and coming toward me was a group of four men and women. And they were all dressed up in the American uniforms. Well, I thought they were Americans. And I said hello, and they spoke to me back in French. And in their arms were laden flowers. And they stopped, and we chatted for a minute. And I said, where are you going? Stupid question. And they said they were going over to the cemetery to give their thanks to the Americans for their freedom. And I lost it. I just lost it. Mel was over placing some flags on some of the crosses. But I was so moved that they said they do that every year to give their thanks. And it just felt so good to hear that. Because looking out on that sea of crosses, you realize the sacrifices that were, that were made. And made by these gentlemen in the audience here today. I thank you. Really, thank you. And Mr. Evans, thank you. I hope you're going to broadcast this every year.
I will.
Really.
I will. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Didn't mean to take up
No.
so much time.
Thank you very much. You'll not regret it. Trip of a lifetime is, as Mrs. French would tell you. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Jerry.
Sure.
Thanks, everyone. Let's give Jerry a big hand.
Thanks.